Welcome. I'm Jennifer Ohman-Rodriguez, and this is Trauma Recovery at Compassionate Christianity. Today we are talking about moral injury with our guests, Reverend Dr. Duane Larson and Reverend Jeff Zust. They are co-authors of the book, Care for the Sorrowing Soul, Healing Moral Injuries from Military Service and Implications for the Rest of Us. The book is published by Cascade Books, and you'll find more information about this book on the Trauma Recovery page at Compassionate Christianity. Duane Larson is an ELCA pastor, currently serving as senior pastor of Christ the King Lutheran Church in Houston, Texas. He is a systematic theologian with 20 years of experience as a seminary professor. Duane also served as the president of Wartburg Theological Seminary. Along with pastoring, he also teaches at the University of Houston. And Duane has written and lectured widely, not wildly, but widely, on theology and science, ethics, and ecumenical and interfaith relations. Duane wrote a chapter about faith community care for the morally injured for the forthcoming book, Moral Injury, a guidebook for understanding and engagement, due out next month. It's edited by Brad Kell and published by Lexington Press. Jeff Zust is also an ELCA pastor. He's a combat veteran, retired Army chaplain, colonel, and current doctoral student at the University of Denver. He completed 33 years of reserve and active service in the Air Force and Army, supporting deployments to Egypt, Somalia, Kuwait, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He's also the author of the JFQ article, Force Protection from Moral Injury, 3 Objectives for Military Leaders. Jeff holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from Colorado State University and master's degrees in Divinity, Education, Ethics, and National Resourcing Strategy. Thank you both for being here today and talking with us about moral injury.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's begin by defining moral injury. In your book, on page 5, you start the definition with moral injury is a complex soul wound. Can you expand on this?
Do you want to go first, Duane, or do you want me to?
Oh, go ahead.
That's a simplified definition. What we did was we borrowed definitions from Jonathan Shea, Ed Tick, Brett Litz, and a few others, and we mashed them together. And it basically comes down to moral injury begins where individuals' sense of value, ultimate value, gets transgressed either through what they do, what they observe, or what they take part in, or what they believe they fail to do. It's that transgression that leads to changes in their behavior and changes into their life narrative that causes problems not only for themselves, but those around them as well.
I would add, that's a very helpful definition, and Jeff really was an incipient inspiration for the whole definition. But I would add, too, that perhaps the term soul is a little unique there when you look at the panoply of definitions offered for moral injury, because we wanted to relate that to now what is satisfying for me to be known not only as moral injury, but spiritual injury. And soul is that word that is difficult to get a purchase on. It's not a popular word in a materialistic Western society, but it does have some sort of transcendent meaning across religions. And we want this to be understood as a kind of interdisciplinary, interfaith effort as well, at getting to trauma to one's spiritual condition. So soul is our cipher for that, if you will.
Yes, I agree. Soul is a very complex word that we use, especially in Christian circles.
Mhm.
So give our watchers and listeners an example of moral injury.
I'll start with something that should be familiar to any number of clergy. I've had the common experience in my pastoral work in various congregations of being at a military funeral and going to the reception or some such after, usually in a person's home. And inevitably, some veteran will come to me and start up a conversation, a can of beer in the hand, to be sure. It's very informal, but there's almost the compulsion for that person to tell me, God will never forgive me for the stuff I had to do when I was in service, Pastor. Usually they say chaplain. And that's a pickup line. When one lives with an incessant sense of guilt and shame, there's something going wrong that has led one to accept that, even with one's own, as we call it, maladaptive behavior, and say that that's just part of God's judgment on me. And that's a self-reflection that anyone with 1 ounce of pastoral compassion is going to want to respond to. When one goes deeper, one finds out that these traumas, these kinds of traumas, have been recognized in military people, as well as others to be sure, but recognized for 3,000 years. That phenomenon has been at work.
Jeff, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, my work basically started as a chaplain dealing with soldiers from not only just past incidents, but instances that were very fresh in their memory. And I was not trained to do so as a seminarian or as a chaplain per se. And it started out as a, how do I say this? Basically a focus on traumatic injuries in terms of post-trauma stress. And the last time we came out of Iraq, this was around 2006, but we've been finding this ever since 9/11, that soldiers would come back and they wouldn't necessarily qualify for post-trauma stress disorder diagnoses. And those that even did, nothing seemed to work with them. And then when you start listening to the stories they tell, you'd find out that they weren't so, how do I say this? They suffered from effects of the stress. That's no doubt about that. But they were processing it in ways that had nothing to do with the stress itself. They weren't these, as some folks have commented, these aren't fear-induced injuries, they're value-based injuries. And so at the National Defense University, I had to develop some papers and write a thesis, and I started thinking about the things that matter to me, and it was this topic. And so that's what started me into a deep dive of this, to try to create a model for what I had experienced as a chaplain in dealing with these veterans, and how to start unpacking their stories. And I think that's really important. If I can use some very colloquial language, for infantrymen, it's a common phrase called "when Murphy shows up and shit goes to hell." But that's kind of what these folks are experiencing. Things that are not even or predictable in combat, even from their own actions. And so how do they deal with that later in life? Because it changes who they are as human beings. Sometimes positively, but a lot of times negatively.
Right. And what I find really interesting in your book is you both, you're very clear that this is not PTSD. In fact, there's a wonderful chart, I think around page 59 maybe, of what PTSD is and what moral injury is. So can you just clarify that?
It's a Venn diagram, and on one side, one of the circles that are connecting is just the DSM definition of what post-traumatic stress syndrome is, and the other circle encompasses what our combined definition of moral injury is. And the overlap between the two circles is this idea that some veterans have both versus just one or the other. Some of the folks that were in my brigade when we came out of Iraq the second time, they were dismissed or released from psychiatric consultations simply because they didn't qualify for a PTSD diagnosis. But yet they were still troubled, and this had third and fourth order effects in their lives and things they were struggling with. And so they sat in this other circle that never connected with PTSD. Others definitely had post-trauma issues, but that overlapped with some very value-based issues that they were facing. And then there was this third group that was PTSD. There was just no question about it. And so the issue became for Duane and I, how do we talk about these different groups of people? What overlaps, what is different, what is similar, and how do we get at it? Is that helpful?
The value stressor piece is especially to be underscored there, because primary criterion around post-traumatic stress is that it usually is some kind of direct effect, either psychologically or obviously physically. Does not necessarily recognize that anxiety can arise from values being challenged. And that's why it's important in recognizing moral injury that the moral injury can happen even by witnessing someone else challenge your values down to the core. And that certainly is a step, if not even two steps away from the kind of trauma that occurs with PTSD.
Right, because PTSD, the clinical diagnosis is the body, mind, and heart perceives it as life-threatening.
Right.
And what I'm hearing you both say about moral injury is that that's value-threatening.
Sure.
Yes, and it's more cognitive.
Spiritually, even spiritually threatening, if one wants to use that term. Brett Litz actually goes that far to say that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the big difference, and then someone can be experiencing both.
Correct.
But I also think that what I read in your book and I'm hearing from you is that the moral injury goes unnoticed, and maybe even in the clinical setting with the therapist.
Yes. The best way to get at that is to just give a really brief story. And it was from a young sergeant that lost one of his soldiers in an IED attack. And no matter what they tried with this sergeant, nothing seemed to work therapy-wise. And we actually had to pull him out of a counseling session with a therapist who was trying to get the sergeant to agree that it just wasn't his fault. And what the sergeant said is, as we asked him what was going on, was this guy will ask about my sleep patterns, ask about my grief patterns, but he won't ask me about my friend. And what happened was the sergeant was unable to save a member of his squad who burned to death in the vehicle. And the sergeant, even though he was wounded, could not get at this person and was still seeing visions of him from time to time or thinking about him. And each one of those visions included this person talking to him saying, "Hey, dude, why didn't you save me?" And so you start unpacking that, and it's just not the sergeant experiencing a grief reaction, but this value that he believed that he needed to bring every member of his unit back. And those units had a face, and they were people. He had a relationship with them, and that's what he valued, and he was unable in the stress of combat to make that happen. And that's what he was trying to process through in his life. And once that was understood, then there were some things that could or could not be done for him. If that makes sense.
Oh, yes. And yes, it makes complete sense. And it makes complete sense why that gets mixed up, both in pastoral care and in therapy.
Needs
So
needs to be said for too that with great respect for all that social workers, for example, and professional counselors need to do, there is a time boundedness on this when it comes to working with veterans. And there is the necessity to approach so much of this from, frankly, a secular or neutral point of view, a values neutral point of view. So the point too often now with therapy is to get to some problem solving, generally diffuse a person's anxiety, the client's anxiety in the matter, so that they can get back to having some kind of functionality in common life, in public life. And when we have so many numbers around us, where I, the clinician, and I'm pressed to deal with so many people in a given day, individually as well as in group counseling situations, I'm not able to get, particularly if I have to be, as it were, values neutral or secularly ecumenical, I'm not able to get at these shame issues that are ruled out generally from at least first order trauma care.
So who are those who can help people heal from moral injury, and what does healing look like?
Long question. I'm happy to let Jeff go first.
I don't think there's just one answer to that question, but I think when you start unpacking what's working with people, the issue of trust becomes huge. And it's not trust measured by the clinician or the therapist or the friend. It's trust measured by the veteran. Who the veteran is willing to talk with, who the veteran is willing to listen to and interact with. And that's why it can be everything from a family member to a trusted friend to a unit member to a professional clinician. Anywhere along the line, it does that, because the central question comes back to simply, why does this event bother you? I mean, it sounds so simple, but those values and feelings are hard to change or let go of. And that's precisely what needs to be unpacked or dealt with so the veteran can progress in life. The work of Crystal Park with trauma narratives is really effective in describing what these traumatic events do to people and the way back or recovery from them.
Which is also different from PTSD healing, because oftentimes that narrative is very fragmented, and the work is in putting some sort of arc to the narrative. Whereas it sounds to me like with moral injury, the narrative's already there.
The narrative is fragmented in both, I think.
Oh, it is. Okay.
That's, and part of the therapy is describing or making sense of what that narrative really is. What's different in PTSD is it becomes a physical scrambling. They'll talk oftentimes about uninvited amygdala hijacks, which is about the autonomic nervous system, which may or may not be present in moral injury sufferers. Yeah. And that's part of those overlapping circles. Because sometimes with moral injury or with PTSD, these intrusions are uninvited. They're reoccurring. They can't be stopped. I may be in the middle of some event in my life and something triggers a response to the situation that I'm suddenly back in Iraq all of a sudden. Okay. That's not necessarily true with moral injury. Some unintruded memories will happen, but sometimes they're consciously held on to and ruminated. They can't easily be let go of, but nevertheless, they're not necessarily part of our autonomic nervous system. I can't even say the word, I'm sorry.
I understand.
Also adding to the fragmentation side, yeah, I agree with Jeff. It's fragmented narrative on both sides, PTSD and moral injury. The argument, I think, is properly made that with moral injury, it's all the more difficult to develop the narrative because usually the client has not had the grammar for it. Not unlike what I said about the very well-intended social worker or counselor necessarily speaking in kind of a secular language simply to diffuse anxiety. Even as much as a religious person these days might have been raised in a particular tradition, the grammar, the vocabulary, the narrative arc is more lacking now, say, than a generation ago for such a person.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is that even a number of clergy are returning to what I'll call a gentler but very intentional form of catechesis as part of the reframing for a person to work through moral injury and to find for oneself the vocabulary and the overwhelming story that will accept the injury into one's life, and with that healed wound, then be able to bring together a new sense of purpose and have a storied life again. So that person's life is fragmented. If God is not going to forgive me for what I did before, that's an abrupt ending to my sense of self and where my own personal narrative, however I might try to construct it, can go. It has nowhere to go until I reappropriate something. And that might even mean looking at a number of traditions to help find a new language for such a person.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those bridges between what we call the spiritual, the soul, and whatever else there is, the psyche of a human. Because one on souls were a lot of these injuries had no religious connotation whatsoever put with it. The language could easily be made and helpful to the soldier, but they were just not a part of the soldier's lives. And I think that's where Crystal Park's narrative therapy really becomes a part of this, because a life narrative gets blown apart in trauma. And once that life narrative gets blown apart, then the issue becomes, can we adapt or assimilate new meaning in a positive manner or a negative manner from the event? And I think what Duane is describing and people like Ed Tick or John Cipolla have done is try to find forms for reconstructing that language that helps veterans form new meaning, if that makes sense, instead of just trying to piece it together on their own.
So Jennifer, when you first asked the question, I said, long question, and then of course a long answer is going to be necessary. You already see that borne out, because the very process we've described itself is multi-phase, requires a lot of time, and as important as it is for that client, it's not a word I like, to find the grammar, it's important for the accompanier, for the therapist, to discover that grammar too. And she or he has to be equal, very democratic in sharing one's vulnerabilities along the way, so as first to establish that trust relationship in a safe place, and then to explore deep with that other person just what vocabularies might work now that had not worked before. So all of that is time consuming, not to mention then the third phase that'll come about, which is to now redescribe one's sense of purpose. As one retired general told me in my research, that part of the solution is that everyone who's been in the military will respond to some new sort of command mission.
And the command mission here being healing.
Healing to a certain purpose. Now, what are they going to do with it? How are they going to be valuable again to society, to others, and therefore to themselves?
And that's part of the military way of life.
Sure. And is it not actually any Christian's way of life? We talk about vocation.
Yes.
And we popularize that to no end. But we don't make that palpable enough yet. It's an ongoing task.
Yeah. But I think what's palpable for the military is this sense of urgency with missions.
Yeah.
Which is sometimes a disconnect between the helper and the veteran, because the helper doesn't live by those same rules. And so it's hard to enter that world. It's a question of translation in conversation. But when the military can grasp that and the helper can grasp that, then it becomes a source of re-engagement. Not just individually, but individual with a community.
Well, I'm just thinking of my own pastoral care training, which has been excellent and comprehensive. Yet I understand about myself as a future pastor, I do not have the language of the military. I don't have the experience in my family or for myself. And so this conversation with you both is very informing for me, that I have to be open to a different language if I'm going to do pastoral care with veterans in general, and especially veterans who are suffering with moral injury. So what are some small shifts in pastoral care that pastors can do if someone approaches them, even informally at a party, as Duane was sharing with us?
I'm going to jump on that question. I love that question. It's so important, and it's so easy yet daunting for the individual pastor to get started on that. I had a dear friend, I won't say who, very successful pastor, said, I just don't want to go onto a base or go to one of these, prayer breakfasts that might be held, once a year or something on base, because all of those colors, all of the language, the symbols, the acronyms, I don't have a clue what that means. It just seems like some sort of secret society. Well, why does that happen? We have, what is it, 2% of the country's population goes into military service, and on 1%, and that's all volunteer. And the rest of the country is blithely happy to say, oh, good for them, we need that, and we'll go our separate ways and say thank you for your service when we have that opportunity. But we don't engage. So I happen, frankly, to think that the first thing a pastor needs to do is go onto a base, make friends, and make a point of listening to that other. We try to get into different language games, as it were, with others. Why not on this one? But it also translates to social policy. This problem is a direct result of having an all-volunteer army and no sense of national conscription. I'm not advocating for a uniform draft into the military, but a shared sense of national purpose as well on the grandest social policy, perhaps required service in some other manner, is going to help us have those common bonds again. But the first piece, that second is a kind of a hyperlink to another favorite topic, but the first one is simply to make it a point to stretch, go beyond your comfort level, and engage those people who have been there or who are there as veterans or currently working, on or out of a base. That's I've never been in the military. I grew up in a military culture, as it were, surrounded by Navy and Marines. And Jeff is the one who grew up military, but that happens to be my particular conviction. I'm happy for Jeff to be the yin to my yang.
Do you have anything to add, Jeff?
Well, I think, how do I say this? I've witnessed this going from the military into Iliff Seminary and the University of Denver, that the language we use theologically is so different in academia. And we build the models in academia and then try to transfer them back to the language of the street. And I think that happens a lot of ways in ministry, as well as it does in psychology and sociology. And I think Jonathan Shea is real helpful here when he talks about, as veterans start telling the story, they don't use the word sin. even though theologically I can see the concept readily applying. But he said, we're not talking Sunday school lessons here. Even though Duane used the word basic catechetics. Am I quoting you right, Duane?
Yeah.
It's the concepts are there, but they're not recognized. Right. And I think it's a willingness on the part of, I'll just speak for pastors, to be able to understand that and to listen and try to help veterans make these connections. And it's not just a pastor's connection with the 1% that serve today, but look at a past generation of veterans, because they're the ones who really built our churches. And not just the veterans themselves, but their spouses, right, their children, their relatives. And so that language is there. But it's never a central part of where pastors connect with their congregations, except maybe on Memorial Day or some of those holidays. But I guarantee it runs a lot deeper than that. And I think that'd be a great place for pastors to start having these conversations, and for veterans to start talking in their faith communities.
And if they're not using this loaded term sin, what words are veterans using? Is it
FUBAR?
FUBAR, yeah.
You know, that's a Saving Private Ryan popular thing, but it's Murphy showing up. And they'll use a lot of words. That's blanked up. That's, they don't have the language other than to say that they're very discontent, or what we say in our book, there's a moral dissonance. There's a disconnect from what happened to what I value. And however they express that, that's the language they're using.
Right. And so theologians and pastors can interpret that dissonance as brokenness.
Nice.
Right. And then we can get to our training in sin.
Right. But we don't do it. We don't do it from a position of privilege, or as we know more in that case. We have to approach that from a place of vulnerability and solidarity.
And I think those words themselves speak very little to soldiers.
That too.
Because they won't talk about privilege. They'll talk about responsibility. Mm-hmm. They'll talk about accountability. And that's part of this frame model that's in the book, terminology that soldiers use to express these types of concepts.
Right, because the culture is very, as you say in the book, very value-based. There are set values, accountability being one of them.
Yes. And sometimes those things are so, how do I say it? Locally defined. And sometimes as academics, we try to do this general definition of something called accountability. But for soldiers, that accountability may be defined by the 5 people they served closely with under, extremist conditions. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, yes. I think it's a truer definition.
Well, it is, but it may not be one that's readily conveyed or understood.
Agreed. But I think so many of these things we talk about in the abstract are very contextual. And I think that's what you're getting at, Jeff, is this, there's a context for each moment of accountability in a military professional's life.
Yes. And one last caveat to that is that even understanding that, how do I say this? That context may be very imperfect, and that context, the veteran may be very dissatisfied with that context, but cannot let go of it. So it's not like it's a hard line that the veteran cannot let go of. It's this idea like, this is the best I have right now, mm-hmm. and I can't do anything more than what I'm experiencing or have experienced.
Well, I myself have a great deal of compassion after reading your book for what our military endures. I'm also very grateful for all the research on PTSD that has come out of working with veterans. And I'm thinking of Bessel van der Kolk right off the top of my head. Like, we don't have his work without his early work with veterans in the VA system. So I'm wondering, and I have been wondering, since we entered this pandemic, and after reading your book, I feel like I see moral injury everywhere.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm seeing it with healthcare professionals and government officials, teachers, and people in our police force or firefighter forces. Just let's talk a little bit about moral injury outside of the military, especially during this time, this very confusing time we live in right now.
I'm happy to start on that one, but I want to start with a qualifier. And I fully agree with you that we're starting to see moral injury in many other places and on an ever more social level. We even recognized that, of course, in the book and made some very specific allusions as to where that has been happening and where we need to have much more focus. At the same time, I want to recognize, like so many other terms that are new to a public, that all too quickly someone might self-diagnose as morally injured as a way to rationalize and remove one's own responsibility in the situation. And so the more popular the term gets, kind of like the term paradigm shift, the famous Thomas Kuhn phrase, nowadays it's so overused that paradigm shift means somebody changed his mind. It's totally trivialized. And the same danger can be a temptation on this one as well with respect to moral injury. So that's a qualifier. We always need to be cautious about that. Having said that, again, it is a genuine problem. We said that military moral injury is the proverbial canary in the coal mine. We've seen it here in Houston. I'm working with some medical doctors, research doctors who are looking the more at what moral injury is meaning for anyone who's in trauma care generally, as well as others. We've seen it as a consequence of the pandemic, particularly those on the front lines in the medical and EMTs who are working so hard, so overwhelmed, see such a dearth of supplies for a variety of unconscionable reasons and so forth. All of that, sense of betrayal from other resources, call it the supply chain or whatever, plus the sheer volume of trauma in front of oneself and not having any success. Of course, there's going to be moral injury. That's why we had a nurse commit suicide. No, she was a doctor, a supervisor, commit suicide, right, in New York City. I don't want to diagnose from afar, but from what I read, that looks to me like an example of moral injury affecting another profession. It is prospectively all over the place to the point where one could ask, and there's a danger on this one again that falls under that important initial qualifier. One could ask, well, might not moral injury be felt on the largest social scale when people in authority betray their position and lead down a obviously morally wrong path that affects hundreds of thousands of people? So yeah, I am very convinced that there is a large social dimension with respect to moral injury, and it affects some professions especially deleteriously.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I do. I really like what Duane is saying and agree with him on this. I think one of the points we're trying to make or have tried to make in the book is moral injury is a question of agency. And there's a problem of separating outside blame from internalized ownership of responsibility or agency. And I think moral injury occurs in that internalized agency question, instead of an outside judgment based upon, hey, this situation's messed up. I'm injured because of this. My values have been transgressed. I think there's a time for that, and I think that's the voice of protest. But moral injury is the voice of ownership and internal unseen hemorrhaging that occurs in our psyche because of it. And I think that's important for us to recognize, because without a doubt, those issues are coming up in the pandemic. If that
That's
makes
really well
sense.
said.
Yeah, beautifully said, Jeff. Said in a way that deeply saddens me as I think about all those people suffering or in the midst of suffering because of some sort of moral injury.
Yeah, and you asked the question as, can this occur on a national basis? Does a nation ever grieve for what a nation does? And I think that's the question where moral injury really comes to the front. And I think we can think through some historical examples of where nations did grieve or nations failed to grieve and that continued to affect the psyche of a nation.
Well, and as long as we're on that line of thinking, what do you think we should be doing now and in the future as a nation to openly be honest about this moral injury that maybe all of us are feeling?
I think I don't have an answer, of course, but I think it begins by asking the question.
I think it does. Go ahead, Jeff.
I'm sorry, Duane, go ahead. One of the things I tried to do as an ethicist in Army schools was make the point that it's all about ethics. We seem to compartmentalize categories to say, hey, this is a command decision, this is a supply decision, but each one of these things has ethical and moral components to it. And simply by recognizing that, we add a depth of agency to the decisions that we make. And I think that's a part of proactively addressing moral injury. The last thing I'd just like to say, and Stephen Krauss and a team of folks have recently published a survey from some data that came out of Afghanistan. It's going to be published in the Journal of Trauma, where they basically found that soldiers in combat can engage and kill enemy combatants, and they walk away from that without moral injuries. However, what they cannot walk away from are those moments when their values have been transgressed, either through toxic leadership, war crimes, or immoral actions. They walk away profoundly affected by that. A matter of fact, when soldiers identify that, it has about 100% correlation with a moral injury suffered by them. And I think understanding that may also add dimensions when we start asking, what should we do today as a nation to face a pandemic? How do immoral actions, leadership decisions, toxic leadership, how do those contribute not to what the leadership views as of itself, but what does it do to the third and fourth order effects of the people who experience the results of those decisions? Go ahead, Duane. I'm sorry I cut you off.
No, that was very helpful. And I wanted to respond with to Jennifer's question with recognition that it's the same sort of question as to what or how can any theology be publicly effective, which already calls to mind that, well, of course, you have to then develop a language that is not parochial. They can be more public, they could be national. And what are some of the drivers for nation states before that enabled them to find such a language? Well, common concerns were especially around lament before honor. That's how the Greek city-states did it at first. even as we note, and Jonathan Shea noted this, Ed Tick, so many others, that nation states early on had required public functions for the whole population to attend. And it was basically a kind of a recitation, as it were, a liturgy that covered the faults as well as the successes of a particular campaign. In our case, we lack a national language to lament. Who might develop that? Where might it happen? For the same reasons as some faith leaders have been reticent to engage military culture. We don't have, except for the exceptionally conservative approach at it in churches, we don't have much going on in mainline or progressive denominations now that will observe Memorial Day or Veterans Day. There are some wonderful examples that I've discovered of late that go to the point of saying, well, we need indeed to do that. A very progressive congregation in Pennsylvania going to the point that it would use Veterans Day to do a service of lament and honor, actually lament and gratitude. I copied that, ripped it off, as it were, my own location and made local adaptation. But to be very public, for example, to get a public attention, to establish what was called a mourning tree, that each day on a tree out by an intersection where people could drive by and see, some 22 dog tags are hung on a branch of a tree. Doing that for, say, all the days of November 1 through 11, Veterans Day. So you have a rather large, shiny tree of dog tags representing the number of suicides on average that happen every day at an active military or veteran's hand. That's a way to capture attention, and then to have the veterans in one's own place write the liturgy. They take participation, they take ownership, agency, in what the lament could look like. And they bring the words primarily, rather than some preacher who would do it from on high or from a privileged position. These are some examples that are exceptionally powerful. A few incipient ones across the country getting a start. But it shows that what we can do as a nation is find a public theology that does not start with the hero worship, which only increases shame in so many. It actually starts with acknowledgement of the utter apocalyptic character of it all, the dark and shameful and harmful and awful character, and moving from there to thankfulness for one's battle buddies and sisters, on to what the next project could be for the revaluation of personal and social purpose.
Well, thank you for reminding us of this value, or the necessity actually, of lament as Christian peoples. And yes, I agree. In mainline congregations, we are just rediscovering lament. Yeah. And I know from my Pastoral Care for Military Service book that I own, the lament is minimal.
Yeah.
I'd like to see more lament in there. Yeah. So these are great ideas. Jeff, do you want to add to any of those ideas of the dog tag tree, or?
First, I just want to say amen. That was well said, Duane. I'm not trying to be a fan person here, but no, right on. I think lament has a place, but there's also a point of the living. And sometimes when you look at war memorials, it's for those we left behind. But part of the healing process of moral injury is also engaging in the living and what's there today. I thought that's what Steven Spielberg's movie Saving Private Ryan did so well. To me, the encapsulation is not the combat before that, but that moment that veteran has in that cemetery with his family. That absolutely makes the movie for me. But I think a lot of veterans are on that level. So I think that's the process of lament in a congregation, that there are survivors that have lived very full lives and continue to live full lives. And so, what is their story or their narrative, and celebrating that as well.
Absolutely.
That's different from hero worship. But that's the only thing I'd add.
So would you say that this conscious lamenting would help veterans and active military not feel forgotten?
They would feel heard. They would feel heard perhaps for a first time.
Yeah.
And feel heard for perhaps a first time is the beginning of redeveloping trust, bringing them back into the larger society, or better yet, bringing myself more into their sense of society. How do we cure wounds? But by first exposing them and doing the cleaning and such. Too often we've just done the quick Band-Aids.
The triage.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're really good at triage, but not long term.
Right.
Yeah. I think one of the things that comes out of post 9/11 is the military's become real formalized with the memorial ceremonies that it performs. And you start listening to soldiers' narratives about the memorial ceremonies. And you find out that those things could be injurious themselves, because it intrudes on how soldiers are actually grieving something that happened to them in combat with men and women that they're very familiar with. And what I found as a chaplain was oftentimes these small units would get off to the side and do more of an Irish wake. Had better therapeutic effect than this command memorial ceremony that they went through. And I think that's how I start to hear Duane's comments on laments, because I think that was the start of the lamenting process for them.
So the command services are, what would be a good descriptive of that? Not the truth.
It's not that they're not the intentional truth. It's that they're imposed by outsiders that the insiders of the traumatic event have to go through with the rest of the unit, if that makes sense.
Then it's not the full story. It's not the full story that needs to be put together and not fragmented anymore.
Yes. A book could be written on this, but I'll give you two examples to make this concrete. A big part of memorial ceremonies in forward operating bases in Iraq and Afghanistan that are more developed are the soldier slideshows, where they take different pictures of the soldiers' lives and put them together with some kind of music, which may or may not have been the soldier's choice and may or may not present the way the soldier would want to be presented, because these things are edited highly by the command, because they'll go back to their families or released to the public. And the lack of truth in that offends those that know the soldier the best. But the second part of that is the commands themselves are simply grieving the loss too, because they bear some responsibility for what happened, whether it could or could not have been prevented. And that has an automatic function of, how do I say this, intruding upon a very personalized grief process. And so commanders, when I was in Iraq during the surge, sometimes the units would gather for one memorial ceremony a day during this time. And these things were very stylized, and they usually included bagpipes. And my commander, leaving one night, basically said he doesn't think he'll ever be able to listen to bagpipe music again. The ceremonies themselves had a traumatizing effect on everyone who went through that lockstep ceremony. And that's, I guess, what I'm trying to say is we didn't frame those things as a process of lament. We framed them more as a process of honoring the hero.
Well, that brings up, I think a lot about with trauma that we are often re-traumatizing the traumatized. And it sounds like here we are re-injuring the injured. And there's always that level. There's the initial injury or trauma, and then there's the aftermath. which can just be as horrendous in some ways for the person. You both are giving me so much to think about. Any last thoughts you want to share? We're starting to get to the end of our time. So this is another or a final chance to speak into moral injury for all those who will look at this video.
I simply want to give you deep, sincere thanks for the opportunity to speak about this some more. It's always a learning experience, even if I or we've been interviewed about something that we purportedly know. I end up coming away with really helpful new insight. I've learned from the conversation and am re-inspired to continue the work, and want to thank and honor you for being about this particular project and cause. All of us, any person of conscience is going to have this experience of moral injury, and some will not even recognize that they've had moral injury themselves until they read the book or encounter something like this. I've been, and I know Jeff has too, with any number of military chaplains who, once they're introduced to what we have to say, we find out that there's necessary time ahead for pastoral care for them. We come through life not always having the right names for what we've been through ourselves. And so if we can, with this book and further work and your partnership, help people all the better to name and to be accomplices for healing for everyone around us. Thanks for this opportunity to be at that.
Oh, you are so welcome. Jeff, any final thoughts?
Echo Duane's thank you remarks, and just underline the fact that I think dealing with moral injury is a community effort. It's not an individual effort. And I think anything that's done to bring people who've experienced this or even have divergent opinions or philosophies about moral injury, bringing them together is absolutely essential and helpful. So I just commend anything we can do to increase that effort. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Thank you for your work in this and for writing this book, having it out there. We'll thank your publisher too, because we all know it's hard to get things published. And I know that I certainly am so grateful that I came across the book and that I read it and that it's now, well, I'll show you. I'll show you what mine looks like.
Wow.
Just full of.
Turn it right side up.
Yeah. Do I have it?
You got it upside down.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. I obviously liked the book a lot.
May your tribe be legion on that one.
So, well, thank you both, Duane Larson and Jeff Zust, for being here with the Trauma Recovery page at Compassionate Christianity, and blessings on your continued work and journey. Thank you.
Blessings on you and peace. Thank you,
Thank you.
Brian, as well.